Hi, my name is Clarissa Littler, also known as Left Adjoint in a lot of the weird and small parts of the internet, and this is a talk I call Poetry and Partnership. So, just a little background about me and this talk. So, my background's real scattershot mathematics, particle physics, programming language design, mathematical logic. And for the last few years, I've mostly been working in education, like the intersection of computation and the arts. So, this talk is about a little ProcGen poetry project I worked on and off this year. So we're going to talk a little bit about poetry, a little bit about some of the things I've tried, what I mean by partnership, and just sort of like what are some of the lessons I learned, how has this project gone, what kinds of things do I think can be done with it still, stuff like that. So the motivation here is that, well, I love poetry. I love reading it and I love writing it, but I often find that I get sort of stuck in writing poetry so that it's a little samey, kind of similar voices, similar line shapes, etc. And so why not work on a ProcGen project to kind of help me break out of that, feel a little more creative, have more fun with it again, and think harder about kind of what makes poetry poetry. And so the goal isn't to generate poetry. The goal is to generate shapes of poetry. And by shape, I mean like the form, the layout on the page, the shape of the lines, the rhyming structure, the meter, all of those kinds of things. That's what I mean by shape. And so the first thing caveat I need to say is that I'm only talking about Anglophonic poetry because that's what I know, and I will throw out that caveat because poetry is different in different languages. So the base unit of English poetry is the syllable, right? And poetry comes in a huge array of forms and rebellions against form and different styles. So we need not just one generator, but a whole family of them. And the simplest generator we can do is just generate blocks of lines, stanzas, and then randomly generate their sizes and the lengths of lines, etc., as just like variations around some mean. And this is an example of that first attempt, right? The dashes represent syllables. We have the visual reminder of like count of how many that is. And here's the poem that corresponds to that. Nihilism in the end times, we're all prophets of a dead goddamn. We're empty in intention and becoming more hollow by the hour. I don't know when we stop believing that we had a future, but I think too many are proud of seeing the end at hand, of sneering that they're not surprised. But when we survive 10,000 years, humanity's lease renewed birth by birth, who did you help live? So, I mean, 2020 is a year, right? So that's kind of the tone of everything here. But so, the very first poem I did on this project, I posted to Twitter back in January when I first started working on this, had this shape, and this is actually what I wrote. If I had been in the garden that day and I'd seen Eve before her first bite, I would have grabbed on tight and I would have told her, don't stop no matter what he says. Because we talk an awful lot about Eve's foolishness, about her sin, but we never talk about how scary it had to be, terrifying it had to feel, to defy your God and only family you knew, to take a snake's word that it could be better than this. So this is already kind of okay, right? It's a few lines of code. It gets you thinking. It produces something very in line with what a lot of modern free verse is, but it's such a tiny sliver of what poetry can be. So we got to go deeper. And so deeper here means generate lines by arbitrary functions of line and stanza number. And we can sort of generate random functions from pre-made pieces, predetermined pieces, and just add them together. And so you can, you can add a bunch of sine waves together, and have a Fourier series. And and if you do that, well, you get something that kind of looks like this. It's smooth, it's organic, it varies, and yet it doesn't feel too regular or too artificially janky. And the poem I wrote that corresponds to this, I worship the moon and the stars. I lose myself in the sacred void that swims with endless energy, the infinitude wholly beyond our comprehension. I was taught to worship a righteous God, a being of absolute power, wrath, envy. His jealousy intertwined with his love cruelty. He was a God who I tried to love, a father I wanted to please, and a distant listener always holding every thought captive. I was trapped and alone. I was emptied out, a vessel. Nothing can grow. Nothing can build itself back up because nothing is really ever just nothing, and the vacuum pulses with life, and the universe is never empty but is full of creation, breathing in and out, rising, falling, being. Nothing is ever lost or wasted, and all the time I mourn is the endless fabric of space. Okay, so we can do things like that, and then but what about white space? What about indentation? So you can the first thing I tried was generate indentation separately. That's all right, but it's not modern poetry. Modern poetry tends to treat the line as a whole unit, the page as an interleaving of text and white space. So, well, the idea I had to do that is to basically and also expand our functions to be things that I'm calling signal functions. They take on different values over the course of a line, and where the line where they're greater or equal to 0, that should be a syllable, and where they're less than 0, that should be a space. So again, doing kind of a sum of sine waves of different amplitudes and frequencies, we can get something like this, which is also interesting, right? It's an interesting set of shapes. The dashes are still syllables. I put the pipes in so that you can read the spaces easier. Well, I mean, for myself, really. And, you get something that kind of reminds me of I don't know, a poet I like Elena Celtic Davis, right? Someone who tends to take classic forms and deconstruct them and rip apart line structure and, kind of break into pieces in her poetry. And so, but going further, well, we've talked about is just free verse so far, but meter is a super important part of poetry, and in English poetry, meter tends to be described as two-syllable feats. A feat that describe the stresses. So spondy is two strongly stressed syllables, pyrrhic is two weakly stressed syllables, and iamb is a weak strong, atrochi is a strong weak, and so an iambic pentameter is 5 iambs per line. That's what Shakespeare's very famous for writing in. And so we have an example here that's has these signal functions, and that's also generating a mixture of iambs and trochees and pyrrhics, and that's kind of neat. It produces something that looks like this, which is weird and broken, and yet you can kind of do something fun with it by leaning into the broken use of space and just let that be part of the poetry itself. I put underscores to emphasize some of the weird empty space it generated. But then there's another thing that's actually really interesting is rhyming. Rhyming is a really historically important part of English poetry. It's not as important now, it's not as common now, but it's super, it's a huge part of the history of poetry in this language. And so the easiest thing you can do is to generate rhymes essentially by a grab bag. You figure out how many different rhyme endings you want. You want it to be sort of somewhat proportional to the size of the poem. You don't want more than, say, half the number of lines of the poem to be different rhyming schemes. And then just randomly assign from the grab bag, to each line. And that can produce some kind of natural looking things. It can also do weird things like this, where every line ends in the same sound, which is weird. But I mean, the whole point of this project is to be weird and creative and do things you wouldn't normally do. So, I mean, hey, I did it. And it's strange. And I did, slant rhymes and stuff to try and ease a little bit of the monotony. And I kind of made it work, and that's cool. And okay, so kind of trying to wrap up here, you can do a lot starting with very little, because this isn't, you're not trying to make something that mimics, great poets. What you're doing is you're trying to make something that helps you write poetry differently than you would have. And the threshold for that is actually not super high. However, as you get more creative with it, and as you do weirder things, you are pushing yourself to do more creative and weird things too. And that's kind of the partnership, sort of this iteration of like, I try things and then I'm like, okay, but I want more. And then I figure out how to code more things I want. And, there's also kind of this sweet spot between freedom and constraint, like combining a bunch of the different things like stresses with rhyming, with complicated line structures starts to feel so over constrained. It's more like solving a puzzle than writing poetry, which is a useful exercise, but not something I would like want to build things to publish out of. And also this all just kind of felt really good. And so what's left? So much. There's an entire constraint handling system that I wasn't pleased with, so I didn't really include it in this. That involves like generating forms a lot like things like sestinas, where like different stanzas are sort of like rotations of each other, and there's other like symmetries you can do in structure. There's also sort of like concrete poetry, which is this very form meets content approach, which, I might end up needing to do in something like P5 or like LaTeX. The way I'm probably going to try that in LaTeX is actually write a like basically write a domain specific language describing sort of the structure of concrete poetry, and then compile. Like basically generate an AST in this language and then compile that to like LaTeX code based off of like one of the really flexible packages, so that and then you can fill that in and compile to PDF, and you get your really freaky formatted thing that would be really unique. Also, this whole thing needs a whole lot more work on UI. This is a bunch of like common Lisp code that is kind of just meant for me to read, but it is still available up on GitHub. And lastly, I kind of want to take some of the things I've done in algorithmic music and patterns and generation from patterns apply it to poetry as well. So yeah, that's my talk. I really appreciate the opportunity to give it, and thank you so much. On this last slide, you can see how to find the repository and find me on the internet, and enjoy the rest of the conference.